Previously, we explored the strange and eerie side of medieval history, from Viking berserkers raging into battle on mushrooms to towns in France dancing themselves to death. We saw the tragedy of the Children's Crusade, the bizarre animal trials, and even exposed the Iron Maiden as a historical hoax. We uncovered the truth about Robin Hood, the so-called Black Knight, and the swamp-built miracle of Crolandabby. We dug into the mystery of Pope Joan and ended with the downfall of the Knights Templar on that fateful Friday, the 13th. But that was only the beginning. Tonight, we step deeper into the shadows to witness what happened inside the secret initiation rites of the Knights Templar. This is where myth, ritual, and danger collided. When Pope Clement V first heard the accusations, he tried to play the part of the shocked holy leader. But under the heavy influence of King Philip, and by influence, I mean an army breathing down his back, his resolve quickly collapsed. By 1312, the church officially dissolved the Knights Templar, and just 2 years later, their last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, met his end at the stake. Before the flames consumed him, he reportedly cursed both the king and the pope. Strangely enough, both men died within the year. Coincidence? Or a little taste of medieval-style karma? This is why people often link Friday the 13th with the Templars. While the superstition itself didn't take root until centuries later, the drama surrounding their downfall is as authentically medieval as it gets. See, the Templars weren't just holy warriors. They were crusaders, landowners, financiers, and frankly, a constant headache for rulers who didn't like being indebted to them. Their real crime wasn't heresy. It was being creditors to King Philip. He owed them a fortune, and nothing wipes a debt clean like a smear campaign, followed by a few well-placed executions. Now, when most of us picture medieval medicine, we probably imagine some scruffy man hacking off limbs with a dull blade while muttering prayers over a screaming patient. And yeah, that sort of nightmare did happen. But here's the plot twist. Not all medieval doctors were clueless butchers. In fact, some of their methods were surprisingly effective. Recent studies of medical texts from the 10th to 14th centuries, along with evidence from skeletal remains, show that surgeons of the era could be shockingly competent. They treated wounds, attempted brain surgeries, and even tackled cataracts with instruments that looked like that they came from a blacksmith's workshop. Take trepanation, for example, the practice of drilling a hole into the skull to relieve pressure, headaches, or, in their minds, troublesome spirits. Sounds horrifying, but archaeological findings reveal many patients actually survived, with bone regrowth proving the procedure sometimes worked. So, less random lobotomy, more last-ditch treatment with a fair chance of success. Their wound care was also ahead of its time. Manuals like the Trotula and Chirurgia Magna describe using honey as an antiseptic, wine as a disinfectant, and linen bandages to keep injuries clean. Sure, it wasn't penicillin, but it definitely beat the old stereotype of rubbing dirt on it and praying for the best. Even dental work wasn't all screams and pliers. Some surgeons stabilized loose teeth using gold wire. Granted, medieval toothpaste was usually charcoal mixed with regret, but they did try. Of course, not everything was enlightened. Leeches were still in fashion, urine was sometimes analyzed, and a suspicious mole could earn you a one-way ticket to the stake. Hospitals were far from calming sanctuaries. They were closer to chaotic monasteries, equipped with saws, prayers, and a lot of shouting. Still, the idea that medieval medicine was just blind guesswork isn't completely fair. Sometimes, doctors genuinely knew what they were doing. Other times, they were improvising with holy water and sheer optimism, but credit where it's due. Plenty of patients actually walked out of those makeshift hospitals alive and in one piece. We often imagine everyone in the Middle Ages shuffling around like grimy wool-wrapped potatoes with a permanent stench. But that image is more myth than reality. In fact, people back then cared quite a bit about cleanliness and grooming. Archaeological finds and old manuscripts show that bathing, oils, and personal care weren't just luxuries. They were part of many people's weekly routines. Now, they weren't exactly lathering up with body wash twice a day or scrubbing with apricot exfoliants. But they did make soaps from animal fat and ashes, and households that could afford it often had wooden tubs ready for a warm soak, assuming, of course, you had someone to lug in the water. And then there were public bathhouses, especially popular in cities like Paris, London, and throughout the Islamic world. These places weren't just for getting clean. They doubled as social hubs where people gathered, chatted, and relaxed in the steam. Some even offered separate spaces for men and women. Of course, a little too much socializing sometimes went on, which is why church officials eventually grew suspicious of the bathhouse scene. Hygiene, however, went well beyond baths. People clipped their nails, cleaned their ears, and even plucked body hair with enthusiasm that might make you wince. Monks followed strict grooming routines, while nobles flaunted perfumed gloves and brushed their teeth with powders made from things like burnt rosemary and crushed seashells. Sure, it probably didn't give them a Hollywood smile, but at least their breath wasn't unbearable. So where did the "everyone was filthy and reeked of onions" idea come from? It mostly grew out of later eras, especially the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Writers in those periods loved trashing the so-called Dark Ages to make themselves look superior. Add in the 19th century's love for depicting peasants as dirt-covered caricatures, and voila, the smelly medieval stereotype was born. To be fair, if you were a serf grinding out 14 hours in a field fertilized with manure, you probably didn't end your day smelling like roses. But the sweeping claim that nobody washed is flat out wrong. Medieval people did bathe, not daily, not always in private, but bathe they did. And speaking of medieval quirks, here's one of the strangest: the ordeal of the morsel, also called the trial by consecrated bread. Picture this. You're accused of wrongdoing, usually as a member of the clergy. Instead of evidence or witnesses, you're brought before a group of stern-faced monks and handed a small piece of holy bread. Blessed, sacred, straight from God's pantry. All you have to do is chew and swallow. Simple, right? Not exactly. If you choked, gagged, or even looked nervous while eating it, that was considered proof of guilt. Why? Because the belief was that divine power itself would stop a liar from swallowing the body of Christ. In other words, your innocence or guilt rested on whether your throat cooperated. Think of it as a medieval lie detector test, but instead of wires and sensors, you got bread and judgmental stares. This wasn't some bizarre one-off either. For centuries, especially in Anglo-Saxon England, church authorities sanctioned these ordeals as legitimate trials. They genuinely believed God would intervene where human courts failed. Of course, giving a dry hunk of bread to a terrified man and calling it justice might not sound too fair. But hey, medieval law had its own logic. Eventually, even the church had to admit the whole trial by bread thing was getting ridiculous. In the early 1200s, Pope Innocent III, whose name suggested purity, but whose politics were anything but, officially banned clergy from participating in these ordeals. And just like that, the practice collapsed. Without monks, there was no ritual bread, and without the bread, there was no trial. Still, the fact that it ever existed wasn't satire or exaggeration. It was actual medieval bureaucracy, served up with a side of carbs. In contrast, the initiation of a Knight Templar was nothing like these absurdities. It wasn't a public spectacle with the cheering crowds or knights clashing swords. Instead, it unfolded quietly, in the still hours before dawn, when the world was suspended between night and morning. A young candidate, often a noble-born warrior, would arrive at the gates of a Templar preceptory, part fortress, part monastery. He came alone, stripped of retinues, weapons, and titles, all the trappings of his past life. His sword, his armor, even his family name, held no weight beyond those walls. To cross the threshold was to abandon worldly pride in exchange for spiritual service. The gatekeeper would admit him into a torchlit courtyard where the silence was almost tangible. Speaking was forbidden unless granted permission, a rule meant to impress humility from the very first step. Guided by his new brothers, the initiate was led into the chapel, the sacred heart of the order. Unlike the soaring cathedrals of Christendom, Templar chapels were austere, with little ornamentation. Lamps flickered against bare stone walls, casting long, shifting shadows. Upon the altar lay relics, shards of the true cross, bones of saints, and holy icons. Every detail reminded the newcomer that this place was devoted to God, not earthly grandeur. The knights assembled in solemn rows, their white mantles emblazoned with the blood-red cross. The candidate stood isolated at the center, a lone figure beneath their steady gaze. Nothing in the ritual was accidental. Every movement, every pause, was designed to strip away individuality and impress upon him that he now belonged to something larger, a brotherhood sworn to God's cause. Even the air carried weight, thick with the unspoken question. Was he truly ready to surrender all that he had been? As dawn filtered through the narrow slits in the chapel walls, its first light fell across the altar. The moment symbolized a passage, the fading of the old life and the beginning of the new. This was not a trial of strength or skill, but of surrender. He did not face an enemy, but an order that demanded absolute obedience and faith. To enter the Templars was to embrace humility before God and loyalty to the Master above all else. The ceremony's first true test was not fought with steel, but within the initiate's heart. Standing before the Master of the Temple, who acted as both stern judge and guiding father, the candidate faced solemn questioning. Encircled by the silent ranks of brothers, he was asked the most crucial of all questions. Had he come freely, of his own will, without deceit or coercion? This was no empty ceremony. The Knights Templar demanded absolute certainty from their recruits. A man who entered unwillingly could never be trusted, and one who sought admission for selfish gain was worse than a liability. So the questioning began with piercing directness. Do you desire to join the company of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and serve God all the days of your life? The inquiries didn't stop there. Each question pressed deeper, stripping away pretense and exposing hidden motives. Did the candidate carry debts? Was he married or bound by vows to another lord or to a woman? Did he hold obligations that might conflict with the order's discipline? A single hesitation could mean rejection. The Templars demanded men free of divided loyalties, for only a man, wholly committed, could fight with a faithful heart. Next came warnings meant to test courage. The Master of the Order laid out the truth of Templar life with stark honesty. There would be no riches, no comfort, no indulgence. The path ahead would be one of hunger, of hardship, and possibly death in Christ's service. The candidate was reminded that his clothing would be plain, his food meager, his possessions forfeited. He would be bound to obey instantly and without question, even to the point of death. This was no romantic vision of knighthood with shining armor and songs of glory. It was closer to a monastic discipline, severe and absolute. The ritual deliberately gave the candidate a final chance to turn away. Many did. Walking away now meant no shame, no penalty. Better to refuse than to join half-heartedly. But if he remained firm, if he declared again that he still wished to continue, his answer would mark the moment he crossed from guest to brother. The questioning was not designed to humiliate, but to refine. It stripped illusions and forced the man to confront the full cost of his choice. Only when his resolve satisfied the master and the assembled brothers did the initiation move forward. Now he stood at the edge of binding himself, not only to a military order, but to a sacred cause that would claim both soul and sword. The next stage was the most solemn, the vows. Unlike secular knighthood, which celebrated honor, wealth, and lineage, the Templars demanded the rejection of all three. The initiate was asked to surrender not only pleasures of the world, but even his independence as an individual. The first vow was poverty. Standing before the altar, relics, and the cross, the candidate renounced ownership of all things. Whatever lands, wealth, or inheritance he possessed now belonged entirely to the order. From that day onward, his bed, his cloak, his sword, even the bread he ate ceased to be his. They were Christ's, held in trust by the temple. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was complete. A knight who once commanded servants and lived in comfort now slept on straw and shared humble rations with his brothers. The second vow was chastity. Here, the candidate swore to renounce women, marriage, and family life. For many, this was the most difficult sacrifice. To abandon heirs meant severing dynastic lines, a duty most noble families regarded as sacred. Yet, the Templars demanded it without compromise. The initiate pledged to love no woman physically, giving his devotion instead to Christ and the Virgin Mary. In a society where marriage defined social identity, this vow set the order apart and fueled suspicions. Men who rejected both wealth and women were viewed as unnatural, even threatening. The third vow was obedience. If poverty demanded the surrender of possessions and chastity required the renunciation of desire, obedience demanded something far more profound, the surrender of will. The candidate pledged to follow the commands of the master and his superiors instantly, without hesitation or question, whether in the chaos of battle or the stillness of a cloister. This vow was as binding as iron shackles. His life no longer belonged to himself. If ordered to ride into certain death, he would go. If instructed to endure years of silence at a remote outpost, he would remain. Together, these vows stripped a man of the three treasures most valued by knights of the age: wealth, family, and independence. Yet in return, he received something even greater, a place within a brotherhood, sworn to serve not any earthly ruler, but God himself. In this act of surrender, the candidate ceased to be just a warrior. He became a Templar. Once the vows were spoken, the ritual shifted into its most sacred act, the kissing of relics. This was not an empty gesture of devotion, but the solemn seal upon the promises just made. Upon the altar rested the order's holiest treasures, a fragment of the true cross, relics of saints, or a sacred manuscript of the Gospels. These objects were believed to hold divine presence, and to touch them was to invite heaven itself to bear witness to the oath. Kneeling, the initiate was guided forward by two senior brothers. He lowered his head, not in reverence to the master or the men around him, but to the sacred relics that symbolized the authority of God. The first kiss was often placed upon the cross, a symbolic union with the suffering of Christ, a reminder that the knight's life would mirror that sacrifice through hardship, discipline, and service. Next, his lips touched the relics of saints, men and women, whose holy lives stood as examples of endurance and faith. By venerating their remains, the candidate pledged to carry forward their legacy, a living torch passed from the dead to the living. This was no empty symbolism. In the medieval mind, to kiss a relic was to forge a covenant. To break such a covenant was not simply dishonor, it was to risk one's soul for eternity. The chapel was silent, save for the soft sound of lips pressing against sacred objects. The assembled brothers stood motionless, their white mantles glowing faintly in the torchlight. The initiate understood that each kiss was not just a kiss of reverence, but a binding seal. From this moment on, betrayal would not only disgrace him before men, but condemn him before God. Centuries later, these rituals would become the subject of rumor and suspicion. Outsiders whispered that the Templars kissed relics in secret rites, or worse, that they venerated objects, a blasphemy. Such tales would fuel the accusations that eventually destroyed the order. But in truth, this moment was entirely orthodox, echoing practices common throughout medieval Christendom. It was the sacred completion of vows, tying the new brother into a chain of faith that stretched back through saints, apostles, and Christ himself. By the final kiss, he was no longer merely a candidate. He was bound by oath, by lips, and by relics to the temple and to God. Yet before full acceptance, the order required a visible act of humility. This moment came when the candidate knelt before the master of the temple, a gesture that marked the passage from worldly knight to servant of Christ's militia. In medieval society, kneeling was the universal sign of fealty, a knight's pledge of submission to his lord. But here, the meaning went deeper. The act was not directed to a man, but to the discipline and sacred mission embodied by the master and the order itself. The ritual was outwardly simple, but rich with symbolism. The candidate sank to both knees, head bowed, hands pressed together in prayer. The posture deliberately echoed the homage of a vassal to his liege. Yet unlike worldly service, no promise of land, wealth, or privilege was offered in return. Instead, the initiate bound himself to the vows he had spoken: poverty, chastity, obedience, and the hardships of holy war. The master placed his hands over those of the kneeling knight, a gesture of authority and acceptance. Then came the command. From this moment on, obedience was absolute. Whether ordered to ride into combat, to guard a lonely desert stronghold, or to endure years of silence, prayer, and fasting, the Templar's duty was to obey without hesitation. Obedience was not open to debate. It was total. And yet, within this act of surrender, there was also reassurance. The initiate was no longer a solitary warrior adrift in a violent world. By kneeling, he entered a brotherhood that offered discipline, protection, and loyalty in return. To outsiders, it may have seemed like one knight kneeling before another, but within the order, it carried a mystical weight. To kneel was to renounce the self, to cast aside pride, and to be remade in service to God's will. When the master finally lifted him up, he rose not as a supplicant, but as a Templar, marked by humility, yet strengthened by the knowledge that he now served not kings, but the kingdom of heaven itself. Still, the ritual was not complete. Having sworn his vows and bent the knee, the candidate now faced the stage that wove him into the living fabric of the order. Communal acceptance. If the vows had bound him to God, and obedience had bound him to the Master, this next step bound him to the brethren standing around him. The knights assembled in solemn ranks were not passive observers. Their presence carried weight. In the dim light, their white mantles, emblazoned with the crimson cross, formed a powerful reminder of purity demanded and blood that might one day be shed. Each man present had endured the same trial, sworn the same vows, and knelt in the same posture. To be admitted among them was more than joining a military force. It was to enter a spiritual family. At this moment, the Master turned to the assembly and asked a final question. Did any brother object to the candidate's admission? The silence that followed was charged with tension. For if any knight knew of hidden sins, broken vows, or dishonorable deeds in the initiate's past, he was duty-bound to speak. Silence was consent. No voice raised in objection meant the candidate was judged worthy, pure enough to wear the mantle of the temple. Acceptance did not come from the Master alone, but from the entire brotherhood. And when the Master at last proclaimed him a Templar, the atmosphere shifted. The rigid formality of the rite gave way to fraternity. Accounts differ on how this welcome was expressed. Some speak of the kiss of peace, a solemn kiss upon the cheek, sealing spiritual kinship. Others describe a symbolic embrace, drawing the initiate physically into the fellowship. However it was enacted, the meaning was profound. The knight was no longer alone, no longer a solitary wanderer bound only to his sword. He had gained brothers who would pray, fight, eat, and even die at his side. Yet it was this very secrecy, the unseen kiss, the hidden embrace, that later fed dark rumors. To outsiders barred from the chapel, these gestures became fertile ground for suspicion, whispers of strange rites and heretical oaths. But to the brothers themselves, they were nothing more than the visible seal of belonging, the sacred passage from isolation into eternal fraternity. The culmination of initiation came with a transformation both outward and spiritual, the investiture of the mantle. For a medieval knight, clothing was never mere cloth. It spoke rank, allegiance, and identity. To lay aside one garment and receive another was to cast off the old self and assume the new. Still kneeling, the initiate was led before the altar. A senior brother stepped forward, bearing the mantle, a plain white cloak marked with the crimson cross. Its stark simplicity stood in contrast to the rich tunics and colorful heraldry of secular knights, where others displayed gilded crests and lineage. The Templar's mantle proclaimed humility, purity, and absolute devotion. The Master spoke as the cloak was draped across the initiate's shoulders. White, he declared, signified chastity and the cleansing of the soul. The red cross, stitched over the heart, was both a blessing and a burden, a reminder that sacrifice and bloodshed would surely follow. To wear this garment was to renounce the world and to proclaim before all men that one now belonged wholly to Christ and his temple. But the honor came with a warning. Should the knight betray his vows, the mantle would become not a blessing, but a curse. To disgrace the cross was to imperil one's very soul. The mantle was not clothing alone, but a spiritual bond, akin to a marriage with the order, that could never be worn lightly. As the new brother rose, the chapel fell into hushed reverence. For the first time, He stood clothed in white and red, outwardly transformed. To the assembled knights, he was no longer a candidate, but a Templar, bound by the same vows, marked by the same cross. The moment carried both pride and dread. Pride that another soul had entered one of the most formidable orders of Christendom, and dread at the weight of the vows now resting upon his shoulders. And so, the secret vows and rituals transformed ordinary knights into warriors of faith, bound not by gold or glory, but by obedience, sacrifice, and the red cross upon their chest. The Knights Templar had become more than men. They were a brotherhood that inspired awe, fear, and endless rumor. But their story doesn't end here. In the next episode, we'll uncover the darker legends that surrounded the Templars, whispers of hidden treasures, lost relics, and accusations that would one day destroy them. This was episode 2 of our journey into the myths and mysteries of the Middle Ages. Stay tuned, because the shadows of history still have secrets left to reveal.